Welcome to the SCDM website, and thank you for watching this video entitled Citizenship and Domicile as Verified by President Obama, exhibit number 01.017 on our exhibits page. This video is based upon President Obama's weekly address given on July 26, 2014, and the title of the address was Closing Corporate Tax Loopholes. The address is available for download on the whitehouse.gov website at the address indicated in front of you. This video is brought to you by Sovereignty Education and Defense Ministry, http://sedm.org. And the video was produced the very same day that President Obama's video was released. Here is our logo. And the purpose of this video is to show you that Obama spilled the beans on how to lawfully become a non-taxpayer. We are going to explain the meaning of citizenship based on President Obama's weekly address on corporate tax shelters given on July 26, 2014. And we will also show you other videos that are related to the subject of citizenship that he has also done. We will establish that based on the reforms he is suggesting, he is proposing to eliminate government and to become the same kind of private corporation that he criticizes. Now, when we say eliminate government, what we mean is that all civil laws passed by the government are based upon a domicile within the jurisdiction of that government, meaning you don't have to be protected by that government and the civil laws of that government if you do not want to be. And any government that removes that prerequisite ceases to be a government and operates in commerce as a private corporation, just like any other private corporation. All other private corporations, the only constraint on their behavior is that they have to proceed upon consent with everybody they deal with, and they have to operate in equity with everybody they deal with. And they do that entirely by exercising their right to contract. And the domicile, in effect, implements a type of contract for protection. We will also establish that he, that is President Obama, is engaging in a protection racket because he refuses to acknowledge people who don't want the only product or service government offers, which is protection. And we will also establish that he is lying by calling what corporations refuse to pay taxes. And we will prove that he is engaged in acts of international terrorism in violation of Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. Now, throughout this presentation, we will be passionate about what we're talking about, but please do not mistake our passion for the subject matter as any sort of an intention to engage in any type of injurious, unlawful, or violent behavior. We are a non-violent religious ministry, and our intention is to prevent violence by the government rather than to promote violence by us. We think violence is wrong, and the type of violence we oppose in this presentation is what we intend to prevent, and we do not believe that two wrongs make a right. We are not, therefore, violent, anti-government, or terrorists. In fact, President Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, said, "A government of the people, by the people, and for the people." In this country, the people are the sovereigns, and it would be insane to be against all the people by being against the government, because the government is the people, but only when they're acting as jurists and voters, and not at any other time. We instead are against government terrorism, as described here, against deception and propaganda of the type exhaustively described here. We are anti-crime. The crimes we oppose are documented herein with the associated statutes. We are anti-corruption. The government corruption is the origin of the crimes documented here, and eliminating the corruption would stop the crimes. See government corruption page on our website at the address indicated. We are against those who falsely claim to be, quote, government, unquote, but refuse to act like a government. The first step in acting like a government is to protect private property and leave us alone. If they won't do that, they have no business being paid to protect you from anyone else. And we instead are against those who pretend to be a government but ignore the domicile prerequisite to their civil authority and thereby devolve into a private, for-profit federal corporation millions of times worse than the Enron fraud. And we prove this in our Corporatization and Privatization of the Government Memorandum of Law, Form 05.024. Throughout this presentation, we are going to show you President Obama's video address, and we will pause at certain strategic points to comment on statements that he makes to clarify what they mean in a legal context. The original presentation is about 3 minutes in length. So let's get started, and we'll show you the opening of President Obama's video.
Hi, everybody. Our businesses have now added nearly 10 million new jobs over the past 52 months. The unemployment rate is at its lowest point since September 2008, the fastest one-year drop in nearly 30 years. 401ks are growing, fewer homes are underwater, and for the first time in more than a decade, business leaders around the world have declared that the world's #1 place to invest is not China, it's the United States of America, and our lead is growing. None of this is an accident. It's thanks to the resilience and resolve of the American people that our country has recovered faster and come farther than almost any other advanced nation on earth. But there's another trend that threatens to undermine the progress you've helped to make. Even as corporate profits are as high as ever, a small but growing group of big corporations are fleeing the country to get out of paying taxes.
Mr. Obama says that the corporations are fleeing the country to avoid taxes. They aren't paying a tax, in fact, as defined by the U.S. Supreme Court. Taxes, as legally defined, can only be paid to a real de jure government. What they pay is paid to people not in government in the form of benefits and entitlements. And even the government they pay it to is a de facto government. For the proof, see the U.S. Supreme Court Loan Association versus Topeka, 87 U.S. 655. And you can also read our pamphlet entitled De Facto Government and Scam, Form 05.043, where we prove that we no longer have a real de jure government because everything that it does proceeds upon force, absent the requirement for consent. That is the foundation of our republic, according to the Declaration of Independence. He also says that they're fleeing the country, but they're not fleeing the country. They instead are changing their domicile, and it has always been lawful to do so and can never be made illegal if in fact they are a real de jure government. This has been true for thousands of years. Domicile has always been the origin of all civil jurisdiction of any government. And he says it's unpatriotic, but it isn't unpatriotic to refuse to consent to a civil domicile or to refuse to the obligations that can attach only after one consents to said civil domicile. And we also want to emphasize that domicile has always required consent and is the only origin of income tax liability. And that word, that status of domicile is hidden within certain statuses found in the Internal Revenue Code. For instance, it's found within the word citizen and resident. Both of those two terms presume a domicile. And the Supreme Court has said that being a citizen is the most voluntary of acts. So you don't have to be a citizen if you don't want to be. And that doesn't mean that you have to abandon your nationality to do so. You can continue to have nationality without having a domicile. And furthermore, even if you want to have a domicile, you can't have a domicile in a place that you're not physically located in. For instance, the Internal Revenue Code defines United States as federal territory in 26 U.S.C. 7701 A9 and A10, and you can't have a domicile there if you've never physically been there or if you don't intend to remain there. And most Americans haven't been there. So let's look at a definition of domicile to prove that. This is Black's Law Dictionary. Domicile, a person's legal, that is civil home. That place where a man has his true, fixed, and permanent home and physical principal establishment, and to which, whenever he is absent, he has the intention of returning. Generally, physical presence within a state and the intention to make it one's home are the prerequisites of establishing a domicile therein. The permanent residence of a person or the place to which he intends to return even though he may actually reside elsewhere. A person may have more than one residence but only one domicile. The legal domicile of a person is important since it, rather than the actual residence, often controls the jurisdiction of the taxing authorities and determines where a person may exercise the privilege of voting and other legal rights and privileges. The key word here is intention of. Nobody can define your intention except you. If you don't want to have a domicile in a place and you intend not to have one, then no one can force one on you. And the other thing that they point out here is that physical presence is a prerequisite to establishing one's domicile. And it says the legal domicile of a person is important since it controls the jurisdiction of the taxing authorities. Okay? This has been true for hundreds of years, and President Obama is not going to change it. Changing it, in fact, would be the equivalent or the moral equivalent of trying to repeal the law of gravity. And I'm sure if he could do that, he would do that as well. Moving on. If you'd like more details on domicile and citizenship and their relationship to each other, then look at our pamphlet on our website entitled Why Domicile and Becoming a Taxpayer Require Your Consent, Form 05.002, and Why You Are a National, State, National, and Constitutional but Not Statutory Citizen, Form 05.006, on our forms page. For proof that Obama understands the distinctions he is talking about, watch his State of the Union address given on 2/12/2013. He indicates that there are two components to citizenship: political status/nationality and legal/civil status. Let's watch it.
We may do different jobs and wear different uniforms and hold different views than the person beside us. But as Americans, we all share the same proud title. We are citizens. It's a word that doesn't just describe our nationality or our legal status. It describes the way we're made. It describes what we believe. It captures the enduring idea that this country only works when we accept certain obligations to one another and to future generations. That our rights are wrapped up in the rights of others. And that well into our third century as a nation, it remains the task of us all, as citizens of these United States, to be the authors of the next great chapter of our American story. Thank you. God bless you. And God bless these United States of America. They're keeping most of their business inside the United States, but they're basically renouncing their citizenship and declaring that they're based someplace else just to avoid paying their fair share.
Obama just said that corporations are renouncing their citizenship. And we now know that what he meant by citizenship was domicile. Therefore, he just admitted indirectly that domicile is equivalent to citizenship for the purposes of taxation. And in fact, the federal courts agree precisely with that conclusion. Here's what they said. Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition, page 311. Domicile and citizen are synonymous in federal courts. Early versus Hershey Transit Company. Inhabitant, resident, and citizen are synonymous. And Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition, page 310. The term citizen and citizenship are distinguishable from resident or inhabitant. The words citizen and citizenship, however, usually include the idea of domicile. Hello, Mr. Obama. And Baker versus Keck, 13F sub 486. Citizenship and domicile are substantially synonymous. Residency and inhabitants are too often confused with the terms and have not the same significance. Citizenship implies more than residence. It carries with it the idea of identification with the state and a participation in its functions. As a citizen, one sustains local, political, and moral obligation to the state and possesses social and political rights under the Constitution. And Early versus Hershey Transit Company mentioned earlier, the term citizen, as used in the Judiciary Act with reference to the jurisdiction of the federal courts, is substantially synonymous with the term domicile. Now pay close attention. They didn't use the word nationality. And nationality is earned by being born or naturalized in a country. So they're talking about a different type of citizenship here. They're talking about domicile. And domicile is voluntary. Being born is not voluntary. You get to choose your domicile. You can change your domicile. You can choose not to have a domicile, or you can choose to be domiciled in the place where you don't physically live. You could be domiciled in a foreign country if you wanted to, as long as you've physically been there at one point or another. So keep that in mind. And by the way, that very fact is the reason why all these corporations are able to lawfully escape taxation, because they simply shift their domicile because it requires their consent. And if they don't consent to a domicile in the quote United States unquote as defined in the Internal Revenue Code, they're not required to be a citizen or resident and thereby become a non-resident, not subject for those earnings that they earn outside the United States. Whereas if they had been a citizen, they would have owed income tax on their quote worldwide income unquote. So yes, it's perfectly lawful to choose a domicile outside the United States, to change your citizenship as a person or a corporation or a human, and to lawfully escape any obligation to the national government or the Internal Revenue Service. Mr. Obama also used the term fair share. The Internal Revenue Code does not define, quote, fair share, unquote, but the Constitution does. Quote, fair share, unquote, means that every taxpayer, not every one, but every taxpayer, pays the same amount and the same percentage of the amount taxed. That's what it means. This is because everyone is protected equally. That's what's behind the notion of what the courts would call equal protection. And fair share also means that those who are not taxpayers, because not engaged in the excise taxable activity, pay nothing, just like those corporations that Obama was talking about. And the excise taxable activity that they were avoiding is public office in the United States government, because that's what all taxpayers are. And if that boundary is avoided or circumvented by people like Obama, then an eminent domain and an unlawful taking has occurred in violation of the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. The Declaration of Independence also defines what fair share is. It says that all are equal. And if all are equal, whatever the government can do to collect payments for its services, you also can do to it. That's the whole notion of equality and equal treatment. Whatever they can do to you, you can do to them. However they acquire rights, you can acquire rights the same way. If they can file false information returns against you and nominate you into a public office called a taxpayer, then you can file information returns on them and elect them into your own personal service by the same mechanisms. That's what it means, folks. That's what fair share means. Now, if you doubt me, here is what Obama said in his first inauguration speech about how you are equal to the government. Was he lying? And here's what he said.
But in the words of Scripture, the time has come to set aside childish things. The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness.
The U.S. Supreme Court also defined what happens when people like Obama try to make people pay an unequal amount or percentage of the amount taxed. Here's what they said. Quote, this is Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, 157 U.S. 429. And this particular case was about the very first income tax that Congress tried to levy after the Civil War. And it was declared unconstitutional, just like the current tax would be unconstitutional if it was ruled upon the way it's enforced rather than the way it's written. And here's what they said. Here I close my opinion. I could not say less in view of the questions of such gravity that go down to the very foundation of the government. If the provisions of the Constitution can be set aside by an act of Congress, where is the course of usurpation, that is, the abuse of taxing power for theft and wealth transfer, to end? The present assault, that is war, upon capital, that is private property they're talking about here, is but the beginning. It will be but the stepping stone to others, larger and more sweeping, till our political contests in the jury box and the ballot box between the haves and the have-nots will become a war of the poor against the rich, a war constantly growing in intensity and bitterness. If the court sanctions the power of discriminating, that is unequal or graduated taxation, just like we have today, and nullifies the uniformity mandate of the Constitution, as said by one who has been all his life a student of our institutions, it will mark the hour when the sheer decadence of our present government will commence. And that decadence is way, way beyond where it should be at this point. The other important thing to note here is that there's a war going on. The Supreme Court said that. There's a war going on between the haves and the have-nots. And all Obama is doing is he's being a Marxist, like any good communist is. He's being a Marxist. He's pitting the have-nots against the haves, and the battleground is the ballot box and the jury box. And it's illegal and unconstitutional to allow the ballot box or the jury box to be that battleground, because it's always been a crime to bribe a juror or a voter, including with, quote, public benefits, unquote, such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And that's why all of those programs can only be paid to those who are already working for the government. They do not create any new public offices. And if they're used to create public offices, then a complete breakdown of the government inevitably occurs, and this war they're talking about commences. And they called that war decadence here.
Now, I want to be clear. There's only a few big corporations so far. The vast majority of American businesses pay their taxes right here in the United States.
Next, we see that Obama uses the phrase right here in the United States, quote unquote. Well, which United States is he talking about? He's talking about taxes, so he must be talking about the one defined in 26 U.S.C. 7701 A9 and A10. And that United States is not the one you think it is. It's not a State of the Union. It's federal territory subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of Congress. It has nothing to do with states of the Union. Never has. And the term United States is just like the word sex that Mr. Clinton used when he was deposed about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. And I'll give you, why don't you go ask Obama what he meant by United States in that speech? And he'll probably say, that depends on your definition of what is or what sex is. And he ain't ever going to tell you what it is, because he's lying. But here's the definition. United States. The term United States, when used in a geographical sense, includes only the states and the District of Columbia. And then they define the term state as the term state shall be construed to include the District of Columbia where such construction is necessary to carry out the provisions of this title. Now, first of all, they're defining here the geographical sense, but that's not the only sense. Guess what? The real sense that it's used means the government. A U.S. source is government-sourced payments, benefits, to otherwise private people. And the receipt of those benefits essentially is being unlawfully and unconstitutionally used to make those people into public officers in the government who have to pay kickbacks. We call them public officer kickbacks to the national government. And the relationship of United States to domicile is important because most Americans are not domiciled on federal territory or within the statutory, which is the one down here, United States, and therefore are not taxpayers under the Internal Revenue Code, because this is the United States they're talking about when they mean sources within the United States in the Internal Revenue Code, Section 863. This is the only thing you pay taxes on, is payments from the government. Why? Because all governments are created to protect private rights, and everything that's not in the government is private. Hello? And the U.S. Supreme Court also said that the ability to regulate private rights and private conduct is repugnant to the Constitution. So the only thing that these statutes can regulate is public conduct of public officers on official business. What have you been smoking, Mr. Obama? That alleged Harvard law education didn't do much good, now did it, Mr. Obama? It looks like you haven't even read the definitions in the Internal Revenue Code. Why are you giving a speech to, quote, all Americans, unquote, or everyone, that only applies to a very limited subset domiciled on federal territory? You are trying to deceive us.
But when some companies cherry pick their taxes, it damages the country's finances.
Now, President Obama uses the phrase cherry picking taxes, close quote. There is no practical difference between people who are not statutory taxpayers and not domiciled on federal territory avoiding taxes, and a government that illegally engages in, quote, cherry picking, unquote, of people outside its jurisdiction to fleece them through deception and coercion and word games. See our pamphlet on this subject, meaning of words, the words includes and including, Form 05.014 on our forms page. Isn't deliberately deceiving people about what the tax codes say and falsely calling everyone taxpayers, that is customers, also cherry picking? Hello? And what really, he uses the word damages the country's finances. What really damages the country's finances is refusing to balance the budget, spending 50% more than you take in, and refusing to cut spending. Hello? This type of damage is far worse than refusing to consent to become a customer of government called a citizen. The Declaration of Independence says we have a right to not be a customer called a citizen and to provide our own protection. That's what these corporations are doing. Earth calling Obama. And if you refuse to do your job, Mr. Obama, the Declaration of Independence makes it our duty to fire you, change our domicile, and stop subsidizing tyrants like you. Are you going to try to criminalize following the Declaration of Independence? And are you implying that following the Declaration of Independence is unpatriotic? Hello?
It adds to the deficit. It makes it harder to invest in the things that will keep America strong. And it sticks you with the tab for what they stash offshore.
Next, Obama uses the word investing in America, quote unquote. Government has no business, quote, investing, unquote, public funds or taxes into private enterprises. Here's what the Supreme Court said on that subject. To lay with one hand the power of the government on the property of the citizen, and with the other to bestow it upon favored individuals to aid private enterprises and build up private fortunes, is nonetheless a robbery because it is done under the forms of law and is called taxation. This is not legislation. It is a decree under legislative forms. What did they just do here? They just said the Internal Revenue Code is not legislation if it accomplishes this purpose. Hello? Next, they said, nor is it taxation. A tax, says Webster's Dictionary, is a rate or sum of money assessed on the person or property of a citizen by government for the use of the nation or state. Taxes are burdens or charges imposed by the legislator upon persons or property to raise money for public purposes, not private purposes. Public purposes, not bailouts of GM, not bailouts of foreign banks. Hello? It says Coulter J. in Northern Liberties says very forcibly. I think the common mind has everywhere taken in the understanding that taxes are a public imposition levied by authority of the government for the purposes of carrying on the government in all of its machinery and operations, that they are imposed for a public purpose. Government has only one job, Mr. Obama, and that is to protect private rights and private property. And the first step in protecting private rights is to keep them from being converted to public rights or government property without the express consent of the owner. That is why all taxation and all government services must proceed only by consent. Furthermore, we would argue that you're not a classical, quote, government, unquote, if you don't require consent of the owner to procure their private property. You can't steal it because we're all equal and I can't steal your property. Hello? And, quote, investing, unquote, ought to be left exclusively to private industry, which is precisely these corporations that you want to rape and pillage so they don't have any money left to invest. Hello? Next, he uses the word sticks you with the tab. The only people sticking you, the viewers, with a tab is President Obama, who refuses his constitutional duty to balance the budget or cut spending and is running up a huge debt that our children must pay and which will never be fully paid off. His reckless fiscal mismanagement will produce anarchy and civil unrest eventually, will bankrupt the government, will destroy all of our liberties in the process, and will work a purpose every bit as destructive as any violent terrorist, but without the necessity of violence. So who's the real terrorist? And why are we paying money to terrorists to defend us from terrorists? Is a more important question to ask. The 13th Amendment makes it a crime to engage in what it calls, quote, involuntary servitude, unquote, and peonage. Peonage, by the way, is slavery to pay off a debt. And the government is the largest source of debt right now. And citizens are the ones doing the paying off. So hence, it is unconstitutional. It is an unconstitutional crime to make the average American surety for public debt and a peon who has to pay it off without at least procuring his consent to choose a domicile and therefore become a statutory citizen. That's why it has to be voluntary, because involuntary servitude is prohibited. And a citizen is the subject of involuntary servitude unless he chose to be a citizen. You are the one, quote, sticking us with a tab, unquote, for a bill that only federal domiciliaries are required to pay, and then kidnapping our identity to make us look like federal domiciliaries. That too is a crime under 18 U.S.C. 911. That citizen, in turn, that is the subject of that statute, is a federal domiciliary and not a state citizen. You're a hypocrite, Mr. Obama.
Right now, a loophole in our tax laws makes this totally legal.
No, Mr. Obama, it's not a, quote, loophole in the tax codes. It's a loophole in all civil law. And you can't close it. And if you try to close it, you cease to be a government. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17 is what makes it, quote, perfectly legal, unquote. Here is the provision the corporations are using. Capacity to sue or be sued. The capacity to sue or be sued, and these are the civil rules, meaning the basis for all the civil law that Congress passes. And it says the capacity to sue or be sued is determined as follows. And when they say sue or be sued, they mean sue or be sued under the civil laws of Congress. And that would include all of the tax code. So it says, for an individual who is not acting in a representative capacity by the law of that individual's domicile. So there you go. You can't have a liability that's enforceable in court without a domicile. And number two, for a corporation, and these are the corporations he's talking about here, by the law under which it was organized. Now, corporations are perfectly within the law to decide to be organized under any system of law of any country that they want. It's always been legal. And if it isn't legal, then the First Amendment is violated because the First Amendment guarantees you and protects you uh, in your right to politically and legally associate. And the act of choosing a domicile is an act of political and legal association. And any attempt to interfere with that act of political and legal association and choose the law system, the civil law system under which you will be governed and protected, is not only a violation of the First Amendment, it's a criminal interference with your right of association. And it's a conspiracy against rights. And any attempt to close it through the quote tax code is going to have to repeal this too. And they can't do that, or they're not a government. It says, for all other parties by the law of the state where the court is located. Okay, so moving on. Mr. Obama, you can't make it illegal to do what these corporations are doing. The minute you remove or disrespect the domicile prerequisite that is required for all civil enforcement actions, and especially in court, as we just saw, when you try to do that is the minute that you cease to be a de jure government and devolve to a private, for-profit corporation, just like the corporations you complain about. Hypocrite. And you also become an international terrorist organization that collects, quote, protection money, unquote, called taxes. See Great IRS Hoax Form 11.302 on our website. And you also are engaging in organized extortion by disregarding the consent that is the foundation of all your just authority according to the Declaration of Independence. Anything that does not derive from consent is therefore inherently unjust. And in this case, the consent is packaged in the word domicile. And if you take out the domicile equation, you've removed the consent requirement, and now you're just a terrorist and a tyrant. And it also causes you to make everyone who pays you protection money into criminals subsidizing international terrorism, where the states of the Union are nations, the nations being invaded in violation of Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution. That article makes the federal government into the protector to prevent invasion, and yet it is the worst invader, and the type of invading that it is doing is commercial invasion. Okay? There's no difference between commercial terrorism, which also threatens human life, because if you can't pay your bills and you can't feed yourself, you're going to die. It's every bit as threatening as holding a gun to a person's head if you disrupt or interfere criminally with their right to engage in lawful commerce as non-residents who are not customers of your protection racket. Hello?
And I think that's totally wrong.
Totally wrong, huh? Well, I'll tell you what's totally wrong. It's totally wrong for a government created to deliver protection that refuses to procure your consent before they protect you or demand payment for that protection, and refuses to respect the requirement for consent in choosing a domicile to procure the protection, and forces you to pay for protection that you do not want and do not need. It is called a criminal protection racket. See 18 USC Chapter 95. Now, that's exactly what these corporations are doing. They're leaving this place because not only are they not protected, they're terrorized and they're stolen from and they're lied about and they're slandered in the media and they're even slandered on the White House website in this very video, Mr. Obama. They know what your game is, and the game is up. The jury is out. They all know you're a criminal and a terrorist. It is totally wrong for any government to go into debt because it produces unconstitutional peonage in violation of the 13th Amendment in having to pay off the debt. And who are the people that have to pay it off? Obama would like you to believe that that would be, quote, everyone, unquote, or, quote, all Americans, unquote. But guess what? That isn't everyone. It's everybody who has a domicile on federal territory and thereby calls themselves a, quote, citizen, unquote, or a, quote, resident, unquote, under the laws of the national government and not the state government. You can be a resident or a citizen under the laws of a state without being a resident or citizen under the laws of the national government. Keep that in mind. And by the way, these corporations know that. They know that if they incorporate in Delaware and they operate in California, that they're a foreign corporation in respect to California. And they're doing the same thing to the federal government that they do in respect to each of the states. Why shouldn't they be able to do that, Mr. Obama? It is also totally wrong to bribe otherwise private citizens with public monies called benefits, because it makes what is paid to the government no longer a tax as legally defined. It is just a bribe to get them to leave you alone and steal wealth that can be redistributed. And it criminally corrupts the political process and the courtroom. It has always been a crime to bribe a jurist or a voter. It is also totally wrong to make jurists and voters into public officers for any purpose other than serving on jury and voting. This causes income tax to become a poll tax and criminally violates 18 U.S.C. 912. Poll taxes have always been illegal. And the minute the income tax depends on being a citizen under federal law is the minute it becomes a poll tax. And that, in fact, is the very reason why the tax is not upon citizens. There is no place other than in Section 911, while citizens are abroad, where they are made the subject of the tax. And this is precisely why.
You don't get to pick which rules you play by or which tax rate you pay.
Next, he says, you don't get to pick the rules or the tax rate you want to live under. Well, guess what? Yes, you do get to pick the rules that you live under. If you don't consent to a civil domicile within the national government's exclusive jurisdiction on federal territory, then you don't have to live by their rules. Hello? And if domicile is voluntary, then the rules are voluntary because that's how they connect to you. Hello? And if you don't consent to lawfully occupy a public office in the national government, then you can't lawfully act as a statutory taxpayer. So you don't have to live under the oppressive tax code if you don't want to occupy an office. And by the way, even if you consent to occupy the office, you cannot elect yourself into the office by filling out a tax form. Now, can you? That would be criminally impersonating a public officer. You have to be a public officer before you become a subject of the Internal Revenue Code, any part of it under subtitles A and C, that is. And if you don't consent to incorporate in the District of Columbia as a corporation, then you aren't a corporation and therefore person under federal law and don't have to live by their rules. That's what Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17 says. And we just read it, now didn't we? And under the civil statutory laws, you are the only the subject to and obligated by the laws of the place that you consent to have a civil domicile. And by laws, we mean civil statutory laws. We don't mean common laws. The other thing we want to emphasize is the national government does get to pick its own rules just like you can. The national government does exactly the same thing as the dastardly corporations are doing that Obama hypocritically complains about. In fact, the quote, United States, unquote, is also a corporation and it makes its own rules. And by the way, it pretends that you're an employee of them, and so it tries to make rules for you too. And if you are dumb enough to believe that you work for their Walmart corporation and that you have to follow their Walmart corporate internal rules, then you're an idiot. 28 U.S.C. 300215A says the United States is a federal corporation. And under the concept of sovereign immunity, the national government is only subject to the specific laws that it expressly consents to. Who's the elitist here? Mr. Obama, you're the elitist, and you're trying to insist that we don't have the same rights as you, even though you said in your inauguration speech that all are equal. What have you been smoking? Colorado marijuana? Hello? For proof that we no longer have a de jure government, but a private for-profit corporation, just like the ones Obama hypocritically attacks, see our memorandum of law on that subject, corporatization and privatization of the government, Form 05.024 on our forms page. And as far as the national government getting to pick its own rules, all of the authority to, quote, make those rules, unquote, to begin with, was delegated to the national government by we the people through the Constitution. And it is a fact, it is a maxim of the common law that you cannot delegate what you do not have. And that's just another way of saying that the power which creates a thing is superior to the power that it delegates, or that the creation cannot be any greater than the creator. The creator is we the people. Therefore, you, as an American whose consent is the source of all of their civil power per the Declaration of Independence, must have the same sovereign immunity that the government claims to have, because it was delegated, and must be equally able to choose your civil rules by refusing to consent to a civil domicile within their civil jurisdiction. Obama, you are a liar and a hypocrite.
And neither should these companies.
Next, he says that neither should these companies. Well, neither should the government be exempt from taxes we levy on our private property that they want to steal or borrow, either. Taxes, after all, are rent that you pay on the use of government property. That's what an excise tax is. An excise is a privilege. It's a tax upon a privilege, and that privilege is the loaning of government property. If they can loan property to you and charge you for it, whether you wanted the property or not, then you can do the same thing to them under the concept of equal protection and equal treatment. Taxes, after all, are merely fees for government services, and they're not the only one rendering a service. You are too. If you didn't consent to their services, and then you don't work for them. And if you don't work for them, then you're private. And if you're private, then you're beyond the jurisdiction of the government. And if they won't recognize the existence of the private, or if they won't allow you to benefit from the private or exclude them from benefiting from the private, they're not a government, because that's what governments are created for. If the government can force you to buy and pay for its services, then we have an equal right to collect fees for their use of our private property without their express consent either. We're all equal. And to deny this is to deny everyone equal protection and equal treatment that is the foundation of the Constitution. And as we said before, Mr. Obama said in his first inauguration speech that, quote, all are equal, unquote. So he agrees with us, apparently.
The best way to level the playing field is through tax reform that lowers the corporate rate, closes wasteful loopholes, and simplifies the tax code for everybody.
Next, he says that he wants to simplify the tax code for, quote, everybody, unquote. Well, Obama is unconstitutionally presuming that, quote, everybody, unquote, and taxpayers, unquote, are synonymous. They aren't. Only taxpayers are subject to the Internal Revenue Code, and not everybody is a taxpayer. And it's unconstitutional to presume that they are. It's eminent domain, in fact. It's a violation of the Fifth Amendment. And furthermore, we're all presumed innocent until proven guilty, which means we're all presumed to be non-taxpayers until the government proves that we're taxpayers. We don't have to prove that we're not taxpayers. They have to prove that we are taxpayers. Hello? And this is a lie. All presumptions that prejudice constitutional rights are an unconstitutional violation of due process of law. And due process is the foundation of the protection of private property, provided for in the Constitution. Here is the proof that not everybody is a taxpayer. Economy, Plumbing, and Heating versus U.S. 470 F2D 585. Revenue laws relate to taxpayers, and we put in brackets instrumentalities, officers, employees, and elected officials of the national government, and not to non-taxpayers, that is, non-resident, non-persons domiciled in states of the Union without the exclusive jurisdiction of the national government. The latter are without their scope. No procedures are prescribed for non-taxpayers, and no attempt is made to annul any of their rights or remedies in due course of law. With them, that is, non-taxpayers, Congress does not assume to deal, and they are neither the subject nor the object of the federal revenue laws. And by the way, this is not the only court that recognized the existence of non-taxpayers. The U.S. Supreme Court did so in South Carolina versus Regan. You might want to read that case as well. So he's making a presumption, and it's a violation of due process and theft. to make that presumption. And of course, we know he's a thief, so would you expect anything less?
But stopping companies from renouncing their citizenship just to get out of paying their fair share of taxes is something that cannot wait.
Next, he says that stopping and renouncing citizenship cannot wait. Well, there's lots of things that cannot wait, and lots of things that are a lot more important than this. Other things that cannot wait include balancing the federal budget by reducing spending rather than increasing taxes, and eliminating the Federal Reserve fraudulent money system, see the money scam, Form 05.041 on our forms page. And the other thing that can't wait is only taxing members of the club who consent to be called statutory citizens. They should not be able to reach, they cannot reach people who don't have a domicile in their jurisdiction, a civil domicile, except possibly foreigners. Okay? And we talk about that in why you're a national, a state national, and a constitutional but not statutory citizen on our forms page. The other thing that needs to be stopped immediately is terminating the criminal identity theft that occurs by unconstitutionally presuming that everyone in states of the Union are persons under federal law. They are non-resident non-persons. Or that the United States includes states of the Union within the Internal Revenue Code. It does not. Or that internal revenue districts exist within the constitutional states. The only remaining one is in the District of Columbia. 26 U.S.C. 7601 limits IRS enforcement to internal revenue districts, meaning the District of Columbia, which is, by the way, the reason the United States had to be defined as the District of Columbia in the Internal Revenue Code, Section 7701, A9 and A10. Or that everyone is a taxpayer and therefore a public officer in the national government, whether they consent or not. And we prove this in the Trade or Business Scam, Form 05.001 on our forms page. IRS targeting of activism groups trying to ensure the government lives by the rules must stop. And the cover-ups of the targeting must also stop. And those cover-ups should have their pensions, those people who are doing the covering up, should have their pensions terminated and be put in jail for a criminal conspiracy against your private rights and your private property. They're just thieves and liars. That's all they are. That's all governments are.
That's why, in my budget earlier this year, I proposed closing this unpatriotic tax loophole for good.
Next, he talks about closing unpatriotic tax loopholes for good. It's unpatriotic to impute or enforce powers to a government that the people themselves do not also have. All are equal under the law. Remember what you said in your inauguration speech, Mr. Obama? That's unpatriotic because the foundation of all of our freedom, as we pointed out in our Foundations of Freedom, video number 1, is absolute equality between the governed and the governors, between all those who are governed. My, how quickly you forget what you said in your inauguration speech, Mr. Obama. It is also unpatriotic for the government to impute, quote, superior, unquote, or supernatural powers to itself and thereby turn a de jure government into a civil religion in which the taxes are tithes. They represent rent on property because the government is presumed to own everything, just like God. And political leaders are gods because they have supernatural or superior powers or privileges, as you would say in a franchise. The courtrooms are the churches. Franchise judges are priests of the civil religion. The licensed attorneys are deacons who supervise the worship services. And worship services occur when court hearings are held or there is voting or juries serving. And the code is the state-sponsored Bible that regulates how worship is conducted. And tax returns are confessions to the priests, deacons, and terrorists in what Mark Twain calls the District of Criminals. And everyone is a parishioner and public officer called a citizen, whether they want to be or not. Domicile and consent are irrelevant. All must worship or die and be commercially destroyed. And the assassins who do the destruction are the terrorists in the Internal Revenue Service, which, by the way, is not even part of the government. We discussed that and proved that in another one of our documents entitled The Origins and Authority of the Internal Revenue Service, Form 05.005.
Democrats in Congress have advanced proposals that would do the same thing. A couple of Republicans have indicated they want to address this too, and I hope more join us. Rather than double down on the top-down economics that let a fortunate few play by their own rules.
He also talks about the fortunate few who play by their own rules. The fortunate few are not the corporations he's talking about. The fortunate few are those in what Mark Twain called the District of Criminals. They write the rules to, quote, benefit, unquote, only themselves. They selectively enforce against political enemies by abusing IRS enforcement powers, i.e. Lois Lerner. An example, IRS targeting of conservatives. They refuse to prosecute their own and only use the law to prosecute enemies outside the government. Notice they didn't prosecute Miss Lerner. They didn't take away her pension. They can pick and choose the rules they want to be subject to by unconstitutionally asserting sovereign immunity to protect private corporate business activity and franchises. Most of what they do is private corporate business activity, and especially benefit programs, because that's not why governments are created. They're not created to provide benefits or to pay money to people. They're created only to protect private rights. And the first step is to prevent them from being converted to public rights or public offices or public franchises or taxable income without the consent of the owner. They can make an unconstitutional business out of alienating rights that the Declaration of Independence says are supposed to be unalienable, meaning incapable of consenting to give or contract them away. Hello? They can become like God by denying the equal right of all Americans to also assert their sovereign immunity by refusing to consent to a civil domicile within any government. If you don't choose a domicile within their jurisdiction, you're a foreign sovereign. They don't have any civil jurisdiction over you, except possibly through the common law, but that wouldn't be civil jurisdiction. That would be common law jurisdiction. They can spend with reckless abandon like a drunken sailor and sink the fiscal ship of state. They can counterfeit currency while we go to jail for doing the same thing. They are accountable to no one because they don't need the permission of Americans when they borrow money. They just print more. So who are the real fortunate few, Mr. Obama? And why aren't you talking about that fortunate few, the ones you hang out with at parties, the ones you charge $32,000 a plate to attend your parties for? The fortunate few is only possible because government is not subject to all the same laws and rules as everyone else, and because it has to consent to the laws that it is subject to. And we call this anarchy. And those in the government are the anarchists. Anybody that can pick and choose through sovereign immunity or whatever means, or judicial discretion, can pick and choose what laws they want to be subject to, or what laws they want to enforce, is an absolute anarchist, because they are outside the rule of law. And here's the type of government anarchy we are talking about, as defined by the U.S. Supreme Court. No man in this country, and we put in brackets, including legislators of the government as a legal person, is so high that he is above the law. No officer of the law may set that law at defiance with impunity. All the officers of the government, from the highest to the lowest, are creatures of the law and are bound to obey it. It is the only supreme power in our system of government, and every man who by accepting office participates in its functions is only the more strongly bound to submit to that supremacy and to observe the limitations which it imposes upon the exercise of the authority which it gives. Shall it be said that the courts cannot give remedy when the citizen has been deprived of his private property by force, his estate seized and converted to the use of the government without any lawful authority, without any process of law, and without any compensation because the president has ordered it and his officers are in possession? By the way, does that sound familiar? The IRS does that sort of thing every day. They enforce a code that doesn't apply to people against those people. And so you could say they're lawless. They're not lawless because they're lawfully enforcing the code. They're lawless because they're enforcing it against people who aren't subject to it. Therein lies most of the problems. If such be the law of this country, it sanctions a tyranny which has no existence in the monarchies of Europe, nor in any other government which has a just claim to well-regulated liberty and the protection of personal, that is private, rights.
Let's embrace an economic patriotism that says we rise or fall together as one nation and as one people.
Next, Obama says that patriotism means we all rise and fall together. No, Mr. Lying Obama, patriotism instead means private property beyond any and all control or taxation by any government, individual rights that are equal to collective rights, so that the collective is not superior to the individual, and absolute equality between the governed and the governors under the civil laws, and no civil statutory law and only the common law to ensure that equality and private property are completely protected, and no financial conflicts of interest in judges, juries, or voters. That means those receiving public benefits cannot serve in any of these positions and are prosecuted by private grand juries without attorney general involvement when they err. And patriotism also means total accountability of those in the government to the people. Ultimate accountability is ensured by the ability to remove your domicile and sponsorship when governments become abusive, as the Declaration of Independence requires. And by the way, that's exactly what these corporations are doing. They're declaring their independence. They're firing the government as their protector. They're moving overseas. They're moving their operations, their domicile, their cities overseas, so they're protected by somebody else who provides better protection. What better way to ensure accountability than competition? And if competition works in the private industry, why shouldn't it work in the government? And why are you complaining that people have a choice, Mr. Obama? Because you're a commie and you think everybody works for you and that you own everything and that they need your permission to use it and that you can charge rent, called taxes, to use it. That's why. What you advocate is collectivism, not patriotism, Mr. Obama. That fraud is described in Collectivism and How to Resist It, Form 12.024 on our forms page. And it's also described in an excellent movie by G. Edward Griffin entitled The Financial Enslavement of the West. He does a very passionate job explaining what's going on and the collectivism that you're trying to implement, you and the Democrats, Mr. Obama.
Let's reward the hard work of ordinary Americans who play by the rules.
Next, he uses the phrase, reward ordinary Americans. The only people government can lawfully, quote, reward, unquote, are those who work in the government. You cannot pay private benefits, public benefits, paid for with taxes to private people. So they can't reward anybody but people who work in the government. And it's a fraud to make everybody an employee of the government, because then we don't have a government anymore. We just have a giant corporation that everybody's an employee of. And that's a fraud. It is an abuse of the taxing power to pay public money to private citizens, and the only reward I want is to be left alone by the government and to not have my property, my private property, stolen, regulated, or taxed, or be forced to participate in any franchise or government program. That's all that I want. That's the kind of reward I want. My reward is just to be left the hell alone and go back to your little 10-mile square cage in the District of Criminals, Mr. Obama. The definition of justice, in fact, means, quote, the right to be left alone. And here is the definition, right out of a book on the common law entitled Readings on the History and System of the Common Law. And this is written by Paulson on Ethics, Thilly's translation, Chapter 9. Justice as a moral habit is that tendency of the will and mode of conduct which refrains from disturbing the lives and interests of others as far as possible, hinders such interference on the part of others. And by others, they mean all others, including governments. This virtue springs from the individual's respect for his fellows as ends in themselves and as his co-equals. Notice they emphasize here, equality, absolute equality. You're not free unless you're equal, not only to everybody else, but to the government. And Obama said you're equal in his inauguration speech, so he must be true. The different spheres of interest may be roughly classified as follows: body and life, the family or the extended individual life, property or the totality of the instruments of action, honor or the ideal existence, and finally, freedom, or the possibility of fashioning one's life as an end in itself. The law defends these different spheres, thus giving rise to a corresponding number of spheres of rights, each being protected by a prohibition. To violate the rights, to interfere with the interests of others, is injustice. All injustice is ultimately directed against the life of the neighbor. It is an open avowal that the latter is not an end in itself, having the same value, that is equal value, as the individual's own life. The general formula of the duty of justice may therefore be stated as follows: do no wrong to yourself, and permit no wrong to be done so far as lies in your power, or expressed positively, respect and protect the right.
Together we can build up our middle class, hand down something better to our kids, and restore the American dream for all who work for it and study for it and strive for it.
Obama also talks about restoring the American dream. In our mind, the only purpose of forming governments is justice. Here's what the Founding Fathers said in Federalist Paper number 51 on this subject. Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty be lost in its pursuit. And that kind of passion is why wars are fought. It is why revolutions are fought, why we had the first American Revolution, why we had the Civil War, because the South just wanted to be left alone by the North. They didn't want their slaves being stolen. George Mason, Virginia Declaration of Rights, also said on this subject that no free government or the blessing of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice. And Jerry Spence with Justice for None, page 124, the best antidote for crime is justice. The irony we often fail to appreciate is that the more justice people enjoy, the fewer crimes they commit. Crime is the natural offspring of an unjust society. And if you doubt that, watch what happens to a person all of whose property has been stolen, who cannot support themselves, and it's been stolen by the government, who cannot support themselves, and who has to turn to a life of crime because the government refused to leave them alone. So you could say that the tax system encourages crime. It absolutely does. A government that, and by the way, the only way that it couldn't encourage crime would be for it to say, all right, well, you didn't pay your fair share, but we're not going to steal your property. We're just going to make sure you don't collect any benefits. You don't collect the things you paid for. And that would be perfectly fine with me. And that would not cause any amount of injustice. It would not put people into a position where they had to commit crime. And until they take that approach to enforcement, they will continue to be the biggest instigators of crime in the country. That is the IRS and the government. And the irony is that they are created to prevent crime. And here they are making it into a profitable business and encouraging more of it and privatizing the prisons and making them a profit center and so on. A government that won't protect you from itself is not a government, but a terrorist organization. And your taxes, which in fact are not taxes as legally defined, but bribes and protection money, are funding a terrorist organization. Now, if you doubt that, we encourage you to watch some of these videos, the many videos we have on the subject of government terrorism on our website. These are very educational, and we'll include a copy of this slideshow so you can click on these links after you watch the video. You can click on the links in the comments section underneath the video. Lots of really good videos.
Thanks, and have a great weekend.
Next, Mr. Obama says, have a great weekend. Well, we don't think that's what he really means. We think he means have a great weekend if you're a taxpayer, a sponsor, a citizen, and a customer. If you don't like us or refuse to be a customer for our protection racket, then here's our real message to you people, the other people, the people who don't want to do business with us. You can go fuck yourself. That's the message. And we will bomb you with a drone because we don't like you if you go overseas. We will sick the IRS and Lois Lerner on you, hide the evidence that we did, and launder the stolen loot to our cronies so they can get reelected. And we will refuse to clear your financial transactions through the Federal Reserve counterfeiting franchise until you snitch on all your customers and essentially become a federal employment recruiter for taxpayers. And lastly, what he really means by have a great weekend is we aren't here to serve you. We only serve and protect ourselves with money we stole from you. So let's summarize what we learned from all this. A free people must expressly consent to the specific services they want from the government, and they must pay only for those services that they expressly consent to. After all, government is a corporation and it's a business, and if private companies cannot force you to buy their products, then governments should not be able to either. And if competition works in the private industry, it ought to work equally well in the government, and that would ensure accountability. The ultimate form of accountability is you simply fire the bastards if they don't do their job. And how come we can't do that? Domicile is the method of doing the consenting. And the First Amendment forbids governments from punishing people for or calling them unpatriotic for refusing to be customers called citizens or residents. And as we said before, a citizen or resident is somebody with a domicile within the exclusive jurisdiction of that particular government. And you're not obligated to be a citizen or resident. And if you've never been on federal territory and you don't intend to make it your permanent home, you can't be a citizen or resident under the Internal Revenue Code. And if you declare yourself a citizen or resident, it's fraudulent on your tax return, and it's fraudulent in your legal pleadings if you do it in front of a federal court. If they punish people, they transition from a de jure government to a de facto terrorist government. And by punish people, we mean punish people who don't want to be customers. Okay, because you've got to have a choice. That's the foundation of freedom. You got to have a choice. You have to be equal and you have to have a choice. And you have to be able to deny other people the benefit of your property and your services. And if you can't do that, then you don't own anything and you're just a slave. And those who try to punish people or coerce people to become customers are de facto terrorist governments. And we prove that in de facto government, the de facto government scam form 05.043 on our forms page. What corporation other than the United States can force you to be a customer of its products or services, that is, protection, and throw you in jail if you refuse to be a customer? That is why government has become a pagan god with supernatural and superior rights that no other human or corporation can lawfully possess. And we prove that in our extensive memorandum of law, over 400 pages, entitled Socialism, the New American Civil Religion, Form 05.016. And you can use that document along with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to shut down this fraudulent civil religion of socialism that worships political rulers instead of the true and living God. Let's make the playing field equal, just like Obama said. Let's simplify the tax code so we know who the real taxpayers are, and then nobody even has to read the tax code at that point. Most of the people. It'll just people working in the government at that point. And by making the playing field equal, we can force them to be our customer and to pay for and buy our services because we refuse to be their customer. If they can force us to be a customer, then under the concept of equal protection and equal treatment, we can enforce them. Might does not make right. Equality makes right. Consent makes right. This concludes our discussion of Obama's weekly address on June 26th, 2014. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to learn more about the subject we covered here, please visit our website at http://sedm.org. Thanks for watching, and God bless you.